I, at one point, as a young person, was conflicted about whether I wanted to go into business because I had some of the same things that a lot of young people have. This feeling that business is evil and thinks only about profit and not about the larger issues. And I found here's a company who does think about the larger issues, and look at how successful they are. As I grew up in the business, I got to know people throughout all of the individual companies within the corporation around the world. I was struck by the fact that I could go to Brazil and the people at all levels of the business knew about the Credo, understood it, and really believed in it. And I could go to other countries and they didn't even have it on the wall. A lot of the young people that were coming into Johnson & Johnson really didn't pay much attention to it. Many of them felt that it was, kind of a public relations gimmick. It wasn't a unifying document.
If you continue to violate the public need, the public good, which Dick has been increasingly concerned about, and I think properly so, that our companies aren't doing enough, pretty soon the public's going to rebel.
Then later in my career, when I had become president, and I was thinking a lot about the corporation and its future in ways that I hadn't before, and a guy by the name of Charlie Serena, who came out of the labor movement, he goaded me. He said, you got to do something about the Credo. He said, we talk about the Credo, but the fact is a lot of our people aren't behaving the way the Credo says they ought to behave. And there's a reason for that, and that's your responsibility. I took that seriously and decided to set up a challenge of the Credo. It was a very interesting experience because Dick Sellers, who was chairman then, I hadn't even gone to him. I just thought it was a good idea, so I did it. And he wasn't very pleased at first because he said, you can't challenge the Credo. That's ridiculous. He said, that's like you challenging the Pope. You're a Catholic. Do you challenge the Pope? I say, I challenge him. I said, I challenge him every day when I wake up. I think at times he's crazy. And I think at times my religion is nuts. Of course I challenge it. Everybody challenges their values, and that's what we ought to do with the Credo. Larry Foster, who was then head of public relations, said we ought to film it. I said, Larry, that is the worst idea I've ever heard of. 35 of our top managers, and we're going to ask them to challenge this document. You put them under camera. I said, it'll be a disaster. So he prevailed. After 15 minutes, nobody knew the cameras were in the room.
If the Credo doesn't mean anything, we really ought to come to that conclusion and rip it off the walls and get on with the job.
I said to them, you guys are in a position of being able to challenge this document, which is really the soul of the corporation. And if you can't live by its principles, we ought to tear it off the walls because it's an act of pretension to leave it there. And if you want to change it, tell us how it ought to be changed. Well, that night, many of them stayed up most of the night.
I think it should be an absolute. I don't think it's a very easy thing to live up to in these days and these times. But I think we should strive to it. You can't kid yourself. The purpose of the business is to make a profit.
Lou, let me say this. Everything you say, Jack, is true. What is coming to the fore now are pressures from society, demands from society, which these pirate barons in the past were never confronted with. But we're going to be confronted with them more and more, and that's what General Johnson was saying. And should we not, therefore, do what is best for the business, not only what is morally and ethically correct, but what is best for the business, by following the concepts of the Credo, so that we do meet needs of society, and therefore are able to do things better and decent and human.
Charlie, that's motherhood and apple pie. And God, we're all in agreement with that. The question is, which of these things are legitimate demands
It may be.
of society, and how many of these can we fulfill and stay in business? Well,
What was happening is they were challenging their own beliefs. That's really what was happening. They'd had a chance to see what their own values were. Dick Sellers, by that time, was a great enthusiast for doing it, that we would then take it to everybody in the world. And then in 1979, we brought in all of the management from all over the world and presented them with a document and said, this is your document. You wrote it. It's yours. Now, you go back and preach the gospel. If you want to have challenge meetings in each of your companies, we encourage you to, because we want this to be an ongoing, dynamic thing. We don't want it to ever end.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. A bizarre and terrifying story today in the Chicago suburbs of Arlington Heights and Elk Grove Village. A 12-year-old girl and two men who were brothers are dead after taking poison capsules of extra-strength Tylenol.
Fall of 1982, the Tylenol poisonings occurred. The first thing that popped into my head was, how could this possibly have happened at our plant?
A warning against the use of Tylenol.
No one knew for days if the poisoned bottles were limited to Chicago. But even as the police and FBI began to search for clues, Jim Burke already had concluded that all Tylenol capsules, not just those in Chicago, but nationwide, should be recalled.
Johnson & Johnson will no longer manufacture or sell any capsule products made directly available to the consumer. While this decision is a financial burden to us, it does not begin to compare to the loss suffered by the family and friends of Diane Ellsroth. On behalf of the entire Johnson & Johnson organization, I have expressed our heartfelt sympathy to Diane's family and loved ones.
We asked James Burke, Chief Executive Officer at Johnson & Johnson, to let us watch behind the scenes as the story developed, and he agreed.
Let me take you through the logical sequence. Number one, this shows us very clearly the consumer was waiting to hear from us, and when she heard from us, she responded positively.
Great.
No question about it. So until we bring the third leg in, which is commercial television advertising, we're not using all the weapons available to us.
What she is saying is that she needs reassurance, and we're giving it to her. What she's saying is the most positive reassurance you can give me is a tamper-resistant package, and we're going to give it to her. And what she's saying, in spite of that, and we have to track this as we go, is that deep down I'm concerned. Your conclusion is, since she's concerned, we ought to go out and sell her. There's nothing more offensive to me if I'm frightened than somebody tell me I ought to buy their product, and I know I ought to buy it, and I feel I ought to buy it, but I can't.
Well, I got a lot of credit for that. But the fact is, my job was made not only simple, but there wasn't anything else I could have done. Every person who worked for Johnson & Johnson in the world was watching the poisonings.
The Food and Drug Administration...
You couldn't get off an airplane in any country in the world without having your baggage searched for Tylenol. If we had done anything other than what we did, think of how those employees would have felt. I mean, the very soul of the corporation was watching us. The other thing I did that I think helped was I decided to talk to the heads of news of all of the networks alone. And by the way, the lawyers hated the fact I was doing it because they didn't know what our obligations were legally. And they were very, very opposed to it, and Larry Foster was opposed. Everybody was opposed to it.
Okay.
I think that may have been intuitively one of the best things I did, because I built a relationship with the heads of news and the networks, and they called me day and night when they felt the need to. They didn't bother me.
One network told me that 20% of their news for the first 8 days
I had
following the tampering was on this story.
an implicit faith in the media,
And I would not
which probably was somewhat unique, because most people don't. Didn't then, and less so now. But I had felt that as long as the public was at stake, the media would behave extremely well, and they did.
Johnson & Johnson announced its new safety packaging.
This package has 3 separate barriers to entry and affords the public the best protection we could reasonably devise. The outer box has glued flaps. Then there's a red seal, as you can see, around the outside, which is the second barrier. And then that's...
All right, look at that.
And that's the third barrier, which is a... Thank you.
This will obviously cause a rise in the price of the product.
No, we're going to absorb the price because we think it's good business too.
We had to make hundreds of decisions on the fly. Hundreds of people made thousands of decisions. If you look back, we didn't make any bad decisions. Really, we really didn't. those thousands of decisions all had a splendid consistency about them, and that was that the public was going to be served first, because that's who was at stake. So the reason people talk about Tylenol when the Credo discussions come up is that the Credo ran that, because the hearts and minds of the people who were Johnson & Johnson and who were making the decisions in a whole series of disparate companies. We organized every company in the United States to help solve the problem. They all knew what to do.
All of the previous managements who built this corporation handed us on a silver platter the most powerful tool you could possibly have. And the thing that worries me most is that people don't understand that to the extent that they ought to.
I was often asked, just because of the Tylenol affair, to talk about ethics. And I start by saying I'm not going to talk much about ethics. I'm going to talk about trust. All of you have relationships, whether it's with a significant other or someone you're married to or your sibling or friends. And those relationships are built on trust. Once you lose that trust, the relationship's gone. And in order to maintain that trust, you really have to behave ethically. You have to behave in a way that serves the needs of other people. I don't think you can separate individual behavior from corporate behavior. I think that what a corporation can do is what a family can do, or a community can do, or a government can do, is to say this is the way we think and behave, and we won't tolerate behavior different than that. I think that having a corporate ethic, a corporate set of principles, a corporate soul, if you will, makes it easier. I have no question in my mind that the Credo is a document that liberates creativity. It helps people to do things better than they would do them if it wasn't there, because they're not hamstrung by having to think through what's expected of me. Do I have to cheat in order to deliver profits? That's a very good question. The document suggests you better not. What the Credo says is you better understand your customer, and you better understand your customer in exquisite detail, better than anybody else does. And to do that, you've got to bring everybody into the process. If you don't use every employee to their maximum advantage in terms of the creation and marketing of the products are your lifeblood, you're going to lose, because somebody else is going to figure out. So that means that you better damn well be responsible to all of the people who work for you. They are the asset that makes it happen. If you look at the third stanza of the Credo, which talks about external responsibilities, I don't know how you function in this world unless you're close to all of your governments, unless you are concerned with the environment. In other words, if you don't take care of all of those other constituencies better than your competition, you're dead. And in the long run, if you don't take care of the shareholder better, you're dead. But if you're going to do things in that way and to do them better than anybody else, I don't know how you do that without behaving ethically. I don't know how you do that without engendering trust in every element that you're working with. So to me, the exciting thing about the Credo is that it's the greatest map toward success that I can think of.